It's a new segment, and like Barney Stinson, I hope this playlist is only building for you. So in our last segment, we talked about Howard Chandler Christie and his career as an artist, World War I propaganda, and how women got the right to vote. In our past 3 Sketchatorian adventures, we talked about political progress, industrial progress, technological progress, with a fair amount of gender thrown in for good measure. So for this one, I thought I'd trouble those progressive waters by looking at something that's a little more traditional in nature. And I'll explain how this image is traditional in 4 parts. In the first part, I'll talk about R. John Holmgren, the artist, and his November 1938 cover for Home Arts Needlecraft magazine, so the image itself. In part 2, I'll talk about the rise in home economics and domestic science. In part 3, we'll discuss something called the Colonial Revival. And in part 4, I'll try to bring this image up to today. Let's get to it.
In this section, we're also taking a step away from the illustration heavyweights. Sort of. Don't get me wrong, R. John Holmgren was a rock star in his day, but his name has faded more than our other examples. That's a fickle thing about history. Sometimes the most popular people and creative works are the quickest to wane or get misremembered. Ever heard of Michael Arlen or his novel called The Green Hat? Arlen was a low-key celebrity who drove around town in a yellow Rolls-Royce, and his book was all the rage in 1924. Mark Twain, whose real name was Samuel Clemens, actually made just as much money, if not more, on lecture tours than he did from book sales in his lifetime. Memory, personally and communally, is a funny thing sometimes. Primary sources, or sources originating from a specific time period, be they books, diaries, newspaper clippings, census reports, or objects, are wonderful tools to reorient our perspectives. Don't be afraid to go looking for them, or ask questions. Secondary sources, like these videos, are interpretations of primary and other secondary sources, like the books published by scholars I point out here and there. Secondary sources represent one way of looking, but there are lots of ways to look. With all that in mind, let's get back to R. John Holmgren. I got most of this information from an obituary published in the New York Times. He was born in 1897 in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he attended the St. Paul Art Institute before moving to New York in 1919 to attend Columbia University and the Arts Student League. He married a woman named Emily Pope in 1923, who often acted as his model for the next several decades. From 1941 to 1944, Holmgren served as the president of the Society of Illustrators. He produced several covers and illustrations for Life, Cosmopolitan, Red Book, Collier's, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, Reader's Digest, Saturday Evening Post, many major newspapers, and if that wasn't enough, his advertising clients included Ford, Chevrolet, Maxwell House Coffee, American Airlines, and American Express. He passed away in 1963. So what do we have here? We have a thin white blonde woman kneeling on the ground in the midst of repainting a Windsor chair. Please note this is our 4th white person prominently featured in a magazine. That's not really by my design. Toss a metaphorical rock at popular visual culture before conservatively 1960, and it'll probably land on a white person. If there were people of color portrayed, the images were not usually complimentary. Racial structures have been in play for centuries, and while divisions between races aren't really real, we're all human, biases, conscious and unconscious, are very true and play out every day. It's important to note who or what you're looking at, but absence and what that absence relates about cultural preferences should also be considered. The image is from the cover of the November 1938 issue of Home Arts Needlecraft magazine. This periodical was published from 1909 through 1941, and as you might expect from its name, it mainly featured articles about sewing, crocheting, embroidering, all the crafting done with needles, and women's fashions, which are articles of clothing made by needles. There's a thread there. In the early 20th century, there were several magazines in circulation dedicated to needlework, like Home Arts and The Modern Priscilla, and even more magazines dedicated to craftsmanship, like The Craftsman written by Gustav Stickley, or mail order catalogs circulated to sell handmade goods, like those from Roycroft. But if the first Industrial Revolution happened from 1760 to 1820, and Revijunia ran from 1860 to 1914, why were there so many articles being written about making things by hand? Weren't there machines for that? Couldn't you buy something a machine made for less? We'll talk about the appeal of craftsmanship over the next few episodes.